Welcome everyone to this special discussion hosted by History and Policy on the links between history and journalism. Journalism has been described as the first draft of history, and we're often being told by journalists that a particular event is historic. We've heard it quite a lot recently, but do journalists and historians have the same priorities, different priorities? Can they learn from each other in terms of their particular skills? And what is it like having, if you like, straddled the two worlds of history and journalism, which our panelists on the whole have? And finally, I guess, history appears quite a lot in the press in terms of what you might call culture war stories, statues, rewriting history, so-called. Is that helpful? Is it sort of going after, straw dolls, if you like? Or are journalists acting as a sort of custodians of public values and sensitivities? We'll touch on all of those subjects with a very, very distinguished panel, which I'll introduce very, very briefly, and then ask them to make a few introductory remarks. Alan Rusbridger, as you all know, was editor-in-chief of The Guardian for a remarkable 20 years, from 1995 to 2015. He was then principal of Lady Margaret Hall until 2021, and has been editor of Prospect magazine since July of last year. He was appointed chair of the Universities of Oxford's Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in 2016, so very much inhabiting two worlds. And he is the author of Breaking News, The Remaking of Journalism and Why It Matters Now. Alongside him is Simon Heffer, who has worked for the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail over the course of his career, serving as associate editor of the Telegraph. And he currently has a weekly column in the Sunday Telegraph. He's also a professorial research fellow at the University of Buckingham. He's a prolific author of, amongst other things, biographies of Enoch Powell and Ray Vaughan Williams, and histories of Britain 1880 to 1914 and Britain during the First World War. And he has just published the third and final volume of the Chips Channon diaries, which he edited. A quite fantastic piece of historical editorship of an amazing set of diaries. Thirdly, we have Professor Anna Whitlock, who is a professor of history, the history of monarchy at City University of London, and is director of the Centre of the Study of Modern Monarchy at City and executive dean of the School of Communication and Creativity. She is the author of Mary Tudor, England's First Queen, and Elizabeth Bedfellows, An Intimate History of the Queen's Court. She is a very well-known commentator on royal affairs now, and indeed was providing commentary at the Thanksgiving ceremony at the Abbey when Boris Johnson was booed by the crowd, and that is I thought that was a historic moment, no doubt about it. Where my own interests sort of coincide with hers, we're both working on a project, The Visible Crown, Queen Elizabeth II and the Caribbean, 1952 to the present, of which Anna is principal investigator. Finally, we have Professor Adrian Bingham, who is Professor of History at the University of Sheffield, where he's been based since 2006. Adrian has worked extensively on the popular press in Britain after the First World War. His first monograph explored press debates about femininity and masculinity in the interwar period. His second book, Family Newspapers, Sex, Private Life, and the British Popular Press, 1918 to 1978, looked at the role of the press as a source of information, and imagery and commentary about sex and morality. And he is also the author with Professor Martin Comboy of Tabloid Century, the popular press in Britain, 1896 to the present. He's editor of Gender and History and a senior associate of our network, History and Policy. So I think that we couldn't have a better qualified panel to discuss this topic. And without further ado, let me hand over to Alan to make some introductory comments.
Well, thanks, Philip. I thought I would just try put three things on the table by way of answering the question you posed to us today. The first is about verification and sources, and the crisis of trust in journalism today, where people are, you could say, rightfully skeptical about how we know the things that we know, the things that we assert. And during my time out of journalism and in Oxford, I think I did learn from my academic colleagues there about their methods in ways that I think journalists could think about. So, as you know, it would be unheard of for an academic in almost any discipline to expect people to take their word for it. They show their workings, they show their sources, they show their footnotes, so that it's not you taking my word for something. Please be my guest. Here is my trail. And journalists tend to fight against that for reasons that are good and bad. I don't need telling that the value of having anonymous sources, and that sometimes people will only tell you things if they're granted anonymity. But as a reader of newspapers, when I was sitting in Oxford, reading newspapers as opposed to editing them, the complete rash of anonymous quotes. I mean, virtually all political reporting is now done through senior sources at Westminster or senior cabinet members. And everything then has to be taken on trust. Well, I have to accept that this reporter, who's had 14 anonymous sources in one piece, actually they are people. They are the people that he or she says they are, and that they said the things that they're supposed to have said. And I think, and journalists tend to be very bad at linking as well. So if you say, look, can you give the source of this, or is there a document behind this that people could visit? And these are habits which I think where journalists could benefit from historians and the kind of rigor that the academy has. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think, a respect in which journalism is clearly different from academia. I mean, we both are searching for a kind of truth. I think journalists sometimes overclaim for what journalism can reasonably do. We talk about speaking truth to power as though the truth was easily obtainable and we are giving you the truth. And I think that it's unreasonable to expect journalists to give you the truth. I think a more modest claim in an age of information chaos is we can give you stuff that's true, and stuff that we can say, this happened, this didn't happen, this is a fact, but we should be wary of saying, here is the truth. And I think in view of all the obstacles that are thrown in our way and the time constraints under which we work, and when you see historians coming along decades, centuries later with all the archival material at their time, at their fingertips, and the time that they have to do things, are still struggling to get at a form of truth. For journalists to be expected to come at the truth or to claim the truth, I think is that I always get nervous around that word, the truth. There was a famous Washington Post columnist called David Broder, who won a Pulitzer Prize 30 years ago, and he came up with a definition of a newspaper that I'm just going to quote to you, which I think feels much more accurate to me. So he said, "I would like to see us say over and over again until the point has been made that the newspaper that drops on your doorstep is a partial, hasty, incomplete, inevitably somewhat flawed and inaccurate rendering of some of the things that we've heard about in the past 24 hours, distorted despite our best efforts to eliminate gross bias by the very process of compression that makes it possible for you to read it in about an hour." And then he added, "If we labeled the paper accurately, then we would immediately add, but it's the best we could do under the circumstances, and we'll be back tomorrow with a corrected and updated version." That feels to me, whenever you read that quote to journalists, they laugh because it's true. That's what journalism is. And I think we would win more trust if we said, look, this is the endeavor that we're engaged in. And of course, the second part of that sentence in which you said, but of course, if we do make errors, or if we need to clarify them, we should be much more willing to do that, gets nearer at the heart of what journalism is trying to do. And then very briefly, the third thing, at the weekend, somebody gave me a copy of a book called The Death of Consensus by Phil Tinline. It's 100 years of political nightmares. And I sat down to read the first chapter, which begins with Harold Wilson and then goes to Harold Wilson's father and Philip Snowden and the convulsions in the economic situation in the UK in the 1920s and 30s. And it's like reading, I mean, I had to jolt myself. This was what we're living through at the moment. And I think history is terribly useful to journalists, a knowledge of history, so that not everything seems so sensationalist and exceptional, we've never, and unprecedented. I think it's useful to be reminded by historians and to get historians to contribute to debates so that we can get a sense of context and trajectory. And these stories, these events that we're living through nowadays haven't come out of nowhere, and some of them are not very old, not very new, they're old. And I think that interrelation between history and the present is something that I would like to see more of in journalism. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. I should just say to members of the audience, please do use the chat function to ask questions. I'll round those up at the end and put them to our panelists, but please don't feel you need to wait until the end if something occurs to you. I can feed it in. It's always reassuring to a chair to sort of see the questions starting to appear before the Q&A session itself. Oh, so let me now come on to Simon and ask you, Simon, to make some introductory remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I agree with so much of what Alan said. And interestingly, I was talking to somebody yesterday about the current political absurdities, and a slightly younger colleague who said, well, this is unprecedented, this is historic. And I said, well, actually, go back and look at the events, the 24th of August, 1931, and you will see that actually it's not entirely without precedent. And this is one danger of chucking around this word historic, or its sister word, unprecedented, because as Alan said, history has so often happened before and repeats itself. I also agree with him very much that history, like journalism, should be about the pursuit of truth. But clearly the difference one has as a historian is that if you're covering events decades later, I'm currently writing a book on the 20s and 30s, you've got an opportunity to go back and look at the first draft of history from that period, which is the newspapers of the period, but then check them against letters and diaries and official papers, cabinet papers, departmental papers, and you can see just how often what's been written in the newspaper is reliable and how often it isn't. And actually from that period, in my experience doing researches, it's quite often remarkably reliable. And I don't know whether in 80 or 90 years' time, people will be able to say the same about what we're doing today. Of course, today, I suppose the first draft of history is social media, and that is completely uncensored, completely unregulated. I know that some people doing absurd things on social media have been brought before the libel courts and punished for making completely grotesque allegations about others. But it does seem largely to escape for most of the time those censures, not least because it's outside any jurisdiction that could rule on it. So we have, unlike in the past, unlike when Graham made that remark about the first draft of history, we're dealing with the internet, with the digital media, and so much else that is putting opinions and so-called facts out there without usually an editor who might fear ending up in a court of law and answering a libel action to control him or her. What I learned from journalism in coming later in life to be a more or less full-time historian was this question of looking at sources and checking sources and trying to verify in the pursuit of the truth what actually happened or didn't happen, and also getting a sense of perspective. Of course, when you're writing journalism, you often do speak to people under the condition of confidentiality, and you then have the journalist then has to make a decision about whether or not it's true before putting it before his or her readers. I had a similar problem as a historian in just editing the Channon diaries, which you very kindly mentioned. Chips Channon endlessly accuses others of doing this, that, or the other. And I didn't want to put into print or be responsible for putting into print grotesque lies about people, even if they're long dead. And so I spent much of my time when editing those diaries, and it took me about 4 years, to check before I published anything or allowed anything to be published, that it had some grounding in fact. And oddly enough, the only times I found that Channon routinely didn't tell the truth was when describing other people's ages, which is a pretty minor sin. Most of the time he was right. But whether you're doing archival work or whether you're listening to somebody in a pub in Westminster, the historian or the journalist has to use his or her judgment about whether what they're reading, what they're seeing is or hearing is the truth. And again, as I say, it's easier to do that when you can compare multiple sources, not just the two sources that a journalist would classically like to have. But if you've got plenty of other material there to do it. One thing that Alan said touched me very much, which is this question about anonymous sources in political arguments. Although I've always worked for what would be regarded as right of centre newspapers, I've always had the rather left of centre view that the lobby system is pretty poisonous, and that it allows utterly deceitful and dishonest opinions and so-called facts to be put into the public domain as though they are true. And when you are reading political diaries, political letters, political papers from decades ago, you can start to see how the lobby system ignores the facts that are in those things, or generally distorts the facts that are in those things. And I'm not entirely sure that a lobby system is commensurate with a free society. It has its defenders. It has people who say, well, we wouldn't get this information at all if we didn't have a lobby system. I simply never agreed with that. I think that politicians, in my experience, and I've written about politics for 35 years, are so desperate to get their opinions out there that they would do it if necessary outside a lobby system and with being quoted if that became the modus operandi. But sadly, there's too many people who've got a vested interest in the existing system, and it doesn't seem that it's going to be challenged again, at least in the near future. You asked in your questions, Philip, about culture wars. I think it's perfectly legitimate to write about these, but we must bear in mind, like all new developments that come along in all our careers, that there's no opportunity to apply perspective to them, because we don't know, we can't predict what's going on at the moment, whether it's about transgender issues or anything else that's currently very controversial, how this will be viewed in even 20 or 30 years' time. It may be that it's looked back on as being slightly silly. It may be that it's looked back on as being a moment of epochal change. Again, that's something that a historian who's also got experience of journalism will be able to tell him or herself is something that should not be rushed to judgment upon, because perspectives do change over a period. I think that just finally, because I don't want to bore on. One thing that both historians and journalists should very much have in common, and it goes, of course, with the pursuit of the truth, is a sense of opposition to censorship of any sort. I can't go into details, but I had a number of issues with the Channon Diaries about censoring things. I was put under pressure both by the publisher and indeed by some other people who appeared in the diaries to censor references to certain things, and happily in the end we managed not to, but it required a certain amount of pressure to be returned in order for that to happen. And I don't think that any journalist or any historian can ever support censorship, and that includes not supporting the rewriting of history. And sometimes history is very dangerous and nasty, and it deals with matters that we would now regard as highly distasteful in terms of treating people's private lives and personal lives. And of course, it deals with great historical events that were truly shocking. One thinks of the Holocaust. And in a world of trigger warnings, I don't believe it serves the purposes of truth or the purposes of history to obscure these things. I think that it's a historian's job to write the truth as he or she discovers it, however hurtful, unpleasant, and shocking it may be, and it often is all three of those things. And I think if we're going to regard journalism as, well, perhaps now today the second draft of history after social media, then we've got to take the same attitude to journalism. Every journalist has got to write the truth as he or she sees it, and has got to go to the most enormous lengths, the more dangerous, if you like, that truth is, to prove that it's true. And I don't want to get on my high horse about journalism. I agree with Alan again that outrageous claims are made for the power of journalism, but sometimes it does great good as well as great harm, and it's the former that we should be concentrating on. As I say, that I firmly believe requires the historical discipline of pursuing the truth at absolutely all costs.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Anna, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel. A couple of things that just sprung to mind before I offer my contribution, just in relation to what Simon was saying particularly. I think I would, and we might pick this up in the questions, perhaps push back on the suggestion of social media as the first draft of history. I'm not sure that I would equate social media as journalism. I think social media is the sort of flotsam and jetsam of social comment, in the same way as the kind of tittle-tattle of the past that might have been collected by people like Pepys and so on. So for me, I think I would draw a sort of parallel between historians and journalists as curators of content in a context, rather than just, so I wouldn't necessarily equate social media in that sense, but of course it's historical material. I think we also, of course, need to consider, I mean, truth, absolutely, and there is a crisis of trust and a question of truth, but we also have to be alive as historians and journalists about perspective. Whose truth? And as we discover more sources, or indeed as we are more determined to uncover the narratives of minority groups or narratives that have been obscured, then what was truth can evolve and be different. So those were just sort of preliminary kind of comments in relation to Simon's very interesting thoughts. I mean, my contribution was going to be rather kind of personal, anecdotal and biographical, really. I mean, I was a historian of early modern monarchy, as Philip said, wrote on the Tudor queens, and then in a kind of rather random fashion, I think, got invited onto the BBC to comment on some royal story. I think it was the birth of Prince George, but it could have even been before that. And basically, as is the way, once you're on the kind of books of one broadcaster, your number gets sort of circulated around. And so over time, I got kind of contacted increasingly about stories related to the royal family, the monarchy. And they were many and varied, like, would you like to come on and comment on Prince George's first day at school? Indeed, when George was being born, I remember being alongside outside Buckingham Palace under the gazebos, where the world's media were gathered, alongside a woman who was wearing a tabard with a stork on it, and she was a private midwife who was coming on to talk about the kind of labour pains Kate might be experiencing. So I was very aware that there is a sense of needing to sort of fill airtime on 24-hour rolling news, but I was also aware, as I began to think about this commentary on monarchy and royalty, that there was quite a lot of journalists and royal biographers, often writing from quite reverential positions, commenting on the monarchy. And I was really struck by, in the main, and of course, there are exceptions, but in the main, there was a kind of lack of rigor and critique in the commentary on the royal family and the monarchy. And there's reasons for that, mainstream media and so on. But I really found that really notable. And so kind of quite deliberately, I sort of slightly rebranded myself as a historian of modern monarchy, and increased, and felt like me being a historian monarchy is obviously an anachronistic institution. You can't understand it without the historical context. And it really felt that there was a piece missing in royal sort of reportage. And then, of course, very recently with the Queen's funeral, I was commenting a lot. I was observing the events, and a couple of observations. I mean, first of all, I found there was this real kind of cognitive dissonance between the past and my knowledge of things like the Accession Council, which previously I'd read about in sources or seen, sketches of being played out in real time, and knowing that this was an event that was going to be regarded by historians in the future, also commenting in real time. And I was doing live commentary, and really suddenly feeling like that moment where journalism, what I was saying, was going to be the first draft of history. Historians in the future would look back on the live commentary of these events. And so I felt really kind of mindful and quite pressured by not wanting to get swept away by the moment, and try and weigh what I was saying with a sense of how people might look at this event and my comment on it in, even just a few months, let alone years, decades, and so on. And I think what was also interesting in the lots of the reports and so on, and even talking to people who were queuing, there was a lot of them felt like, this is history in the making, isn't it? This is history in the making. And it was like, what does that really mean? Because I think lots of people, I think there's a sort of general phenomenon in this country, like many others, that there is a kind of profound historical illiteracy. I mean, many of us, certainly my generation, we didn't learn good, solid, chronological historical narratives. It was all very piecemeal. And so there's a sense that people were living through history, but I'm not sure what they were kind of using to latch that sense of history onto. And of course, then journalists were talking about unprecedented and historical making, history making. And I think there can be a tendency, as people have alluded to, and as Philip's opening remarks suggested, that journalists, through the kind of events that we've been talking about, fall back on saying this is historical, this is unprecedented, this has never happened. And it may mean that simply they haven't witnessed it before. It doesn't mean that it hasn't happened at all. And I think it's, notable that on programs like Question Time, and more often just on major news broadcasts, that there isn't more often a historian contextualizing what is happening. I mean, people reach for historical parallels so often. I mean, in the current crisis, the 1970s that people are looking to. And we all end up sort of thinking, okay, that's the frame through which we're looking at that. And so I do think there is a need for it, but I think it can be done, the kind of link between history and journalism, and when journalists really lean into and immerse themselves in history, and how far they actually do that or just pay lip service does vary. I mean, my second just quick comment would be harking back to Brexit. And I remember there was a gathering at number 11 Downing Street a few weeks, I think it was, before the vote, and it was quite bizarre. It was a panel of very distinguished historians: Linda Colley, Keith Thomas, Chris, Regis Professor at Cambridge, isn't it? Chris Clark, and others, David Cannadine, and they were commenting, and it was a really amazing panel discussion full of historians, really, most of which had Remain sentiment. But the discussion was so nuanced. Keith Thomas was talking about Ireland and the potential dangers of, or the implications for the Good Friday Agreement and so on. And I left that thinking, oh my goodness, like, why is this discussion, why is this nuanced debate not being reflected in the press? I mean, it felt so important. And then a day after the vote, there was a public history gathering actually at the IHR. And a group of us, and I remember sort of a group of public historians, looking around and thinking, what, most of them, as I say, being Remainers, and saying we really kind of missed a moment, that we should have stepped up more. We should have forced our way more onto the broadcast platforms, informing this discussion, which was so lacking in nuanced historical framing. And I was really struck by both the responsibility of historians to step into the contemporary moment. For me, there's a real urgency to do that as a historian, to give that kind of longer term perspective. And I have to say now, running a school which the Department of Journalism at City is part, we've just launched an undergraduate degree in history, politics and journalism. And I have to say, like, the more work that I do, the more I actually feel at home among journalists. And actually, I feel that things are changing. And actually, I have really, really interesting discussions with journalists now, because I think there is a sense, and particularly I think looking forward with reporting on the monarchy, that we are now in a moment where a more critical discourse may begin to emerge away from the kind of consensus of reverence that has dominated the media for many decades. So I think it's an interesting moment. And I do think, good journalism is informed by history. But I also think, and certainly this is true for me, that taking a kind of journalistic perspective to sort of my historical thinking and writing articles, for example, for op-eds and other journalistic publications, has sharpened my thoughts. It's made me think in a much more crisp and hopefully articulate and coherent way than perhaps a long journal article or some other historical format might demand. Sorry, I hope I haven't gone on too long, Philip.
Not at all. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. And finally, over to Adrian.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to offer three brief reflections on this idea of journalism as a first draft of history from a historian's perspective, before saying something about what I think, following up from what Anna was just saying about what historians I think can learn from journalists. We've heard a lot about what journalists can learn from historians, but I think there's plenty in the other direction. First off, in terms of this idea of the rough draft of history, I mean, I do think we need to bear in mind there are lots of different types of journalists and there are lots of different types of historian, and the idea of journalism being this sort of first rough draft of history is based on a slightly old-fashioned notion of sort of reporters going out there to gather facts for the newspapers, and then historians, producing chronological narratives which more accurately and with further evidence can sort of produce a second and further and more complete draft. I mean, actually, many journalists are not reporters out for facts, but commentators, campaigners, provocateurs, you know, or whatever, and quite rightly. And similarly, many historians are not trying to create chronological records or producing objective accounts of public life. And indeed, lots of historians are interested in language and meaning, and actually use newspapers as much for the language of contemporary opinion and attitude as much as this idea of as a first draft. So I think that's something we should reflect on. I also think this idea of the first draft, I mean, to some extent, sadly, exaggerates the respect on either side sometimes. I mean, historians have often traditionally been fairly skeptical and snobbish and rather superior about newspapers as sources, not trusting them, and following from what Alan was saying, the definition of a newspaper, seeing them as hastily produced, partisan, uncritical, not letting the facts get in the way of a good story. And so, you know, historians have often been wrongly probably skeptical. And I have to say, as someone looking, say, at papers of the 20s and 30s, I'm often struck by how amazingly accurate newspapers were. But, you know, they weren't necessarily considered as such, especially on reporting of technical and scientific issues. And you see lots of interwar moaning from academics about the quality of, you know, journalists with numbers and statistics and all the rest of it. I think it's also worth saying too that newspapers have also not necessarily had a helpful attitude to scholars and historians, and have not seen themselves as a resource for history, with few exceptions, of which I would say that The Guardian is one in terms of thinking of its archive and presenting its archive. But even with so-called newspapers of record, I mean, you try and get stuff out of the Times archive, and it's exceptionally difficult. And if you go to popular newspapers, they have no real sense of themselves as historical resources. I mean, one of the exceptions to that is the Daily Express, by chance, because of the Lord Beaverbrook archive in the House of Lords Record Office. Beaverbrook, as owner of the Express, saw himself as a great figure in history, and had a esteemed historian, A.J.B. Taylor, writing his biography, and his papers are deposited, and are an amazing resource for historians and a window into the journalism of the time. But for most popular papers, they've just shredded archives. The number of times I was writing to the Daily Mail sort of 20 years ago at the start of my research, asking about editorial archives, no, they don't exist, and they just assumed I was trying to dig up something about, you know, Rothermere in the 1930s or something like that. But, you know, the newspapers haven't necessarily respected what historians could do, or how they could use newspapers as a historical source. And the final point is that until recently, newspapers have not been user-friendly for historians to get information out of. I mean, it's slightly quaint to think that the Times used to produce an index, which I guess was a nod to ways in which you could subsequently use it. But I'm probably the last generation of historian who had to go to Colindale newspaper library in North London, and, you know, sit in darkened rooms and, you know, wheel through the microfilm, or you know, go through hard copy, which is exceptionally time consuming and exceptionally difficult. And what's transformed everything actually for historians is digitization of newspapers. And now suddenly at our fingertips, historians are able to access those newspapers, and you can go back and do all sorts of interesting things and find the needle in a haystack with word searching, which is obviously you couldn't do reading through newspaper files. So I think that with digitization, suddenly for the first time in the last sort of 10 years, historians are able to finally mine newspapers as a first draft after many years of not really wanting to do that. Just a final point for now is that you know, we've heard, and I would agree with many of the comments about what contemporary journalism can learn from having a historical perspective. I mean, I think historians and academics more broadly have often been their own worst enemy in writing for themselves, in writing in opaque ways, in not reaching out, in not understanding the business of journalism, and always wanting to say, well, things are more complicated, that always more, it's needing to qualify every statement, and not being able sometimes to produce the sort of concise and interesting and engaging forms of historical perspective that really we need. And there have been historians who obviously can do that very successfully, and from the AJP Taylors to Neil Ferguson's and Adam Tooze's and people like that. There's plenty of historians there, but I mean, I think often they've had to semi-leave the academy to get those positions, and I think the academy needs to think to some extent about how it trains historians to reach out to journalists and a wider public, and this indeed is something that history and policy in its small ways is trying to do. But I think historians as a profession, as a discipline, need to reflect on how we can contribute to public debate in a more engaging way.
Thank you very much indeed. And can I just say to the panelists, please, if you'd like to come in and comment on something that one of the other members of the panel said, just raise an actual electronic hand at any point. And members of the audience, please do start to put down your thoughts on chat in the form of questions to our panelists. I want to come back to something that Simon touched on, which is the issue of censorship and freedom of speech. And it strikes me that this is something that, in a way, journalists and particularly contemporary historians have a kind of common interest in. And to the extent that we self-censor and have to censor. I mean, we may say that we are, we're seekers after truth, that we want to put as much as what we believe to be true into the public domain. But we know that we can't do that. We have responsibilities to our sources, to the people we've spoken to. We're constrained by law, we're constrained. We know that we're only in a position in some cases to get close to the truth because of a network of relationships which might be compromised if we say certain things that we know. And indeed, as citizens, we might feel a kind of responsibility if we come across stuff that has sort of national security implications or something like that. So how do we, what are the kind of the ethical bases for negotiating this? Alan, I mean, you in the middle of the Snowden affair of WikiLeaks, where you were really at the very sharp end of issues around censorship. How did you handle that?
My policy was always to look at the story and weigh the story and think, is this significant? Is this important? What is the public interest? It's just I've wrestled throughout my journalistic career with this issue of sources, and acknowledging that quite often the motives of sources are quite dubious, and people bring information to newspapers for all kinds of reasons, and you think about that. But in the end, I think you have to put that on one side, and you think, okay, in the case of the Snowden archive, we had a great number of documents, most of which we weren't interested in or didn't think it was right to use or couldn't use. And that left a nucleus of stories that we thought were significant and important. And it was interesting in that context working with American journalists who have a much more open relationship with governments. And they did things that would not come naturally to a British journalist. So they would go to the White House maybe a week in advance, or the CIA or the NSA, and say, we have these documents, can we talk about them, because we're intending to run them. and quite often would then have a fruitful conversation about the documents. And the American attitude really was, well, we wish you didn't have those documents. We disapprove of that, but you've got them. And we'll now talk to you because it's in both of our interests that you publish them as responsibly as possible. The British attitude tended to be, we won't confirm or deny that those documents you have are real documents, and we won't talk to you anyway. Although they started to later, and then you have to come to a decision about what you consider, why you consider this is important to publish, and why that overrides any other concerns that people might have. And I think that is publish and be damned. If you make the wrong choice about that, then you should be damned. But it's entirely wrong, as the British government tried to do in the Snowden case, to try and stop us in advance from publishing it, or say you've had enough, you've had your fun, now stop. That seemed to be a very rudimentary point, that you couldn't leave it to government to be the arbiter of what the national interest was.
And what was your experience of that sort of gentleman's agreement system, of the D-notice system?
Well, funnily enough, it worked fine with us. I mean, I think it's now called the DA notice system, and right. People on the call who don't know about it, it's a voluntary system in which journalists agree to tell it's usually a retired rear admiral or wing commander living in Wiltshire, who you have to ring up and say, wing commander, I have this story about X, Y, and Z. And he is then the route to the government, and then he comes back and says, well, I can't, and I think in all cases, he came back to us and said, I can't think of a reason for you not to publish this, because he has criteria. And so, in fact, it worked quite well for us, because we didn't encounter a story. I think that's right. I mean, there may have been one or two stories where he said, look, that bullet point number 5 on that slide on page 15, the government would prefer you not to. And that was, that seemed fine. That seemed a perfectly reasonable approach to take.
Simon, would you like to come in on this?
Well, I've only ever edited newspapers on Sundays on occasion, and I've never had to confront such significant issues as Alan, in his long career as an editor, had to. My main contribution on this must be having spent 35 years or so writing about politics and talking to politicians. One has to make a moral judgment about talking to them in the first place, really. Alan's right to say that some people have very dubious motives in going to a newspaper and wanting to tell you something. On the other hand, some people are genuinely affronted. I mean, this happened actually under the last Prime Minister. I had a number of politicians who I didn't really know very well, but who knew that I was incredibly skeptical and had been for many years about the probity and honesty of the last Prime Minister. And they came to me and told me various stories of a disturbing nature about him, some of which I wrote. And I think in that situation, you have to think of your own reputation. You have to think, well, my readers, I hope, trust me. And if I write this, I hope that they'll trust that I'm telling the truth, even though I'm not naming where the source comes from, because, of course, the people who spoke to me were, in several cases, people who were members of the government and who would have had to resign. I mean, some of them ended up resigning anyway, among the 56 who eventually went. But and I think that is the judgment that any good journalist has to make. And any good editor, in appointing a journalist, whether to the staff of a newspaper or to a particular responsibility in a newspaper, has to know that he or she is appointing somebody who is honest and does understand the difference between right and wrong and truth and fiction, and isn't has the wit not to allow himself to be manipulated. If you get a reputation for writing rubbish, and going back to what was said earlier about royal correspondents, some of them write some of the most unutterable crap it's imaginable, and a lot of it's simply made up, as far as I can see. then your readers are not going to take you very seriously. And frankly, you could quote Mickey Mouse as your source, it wouldn't make any difference to your credibility. But if you do have a reputation for being an honest and reliable journalist of long standing, who has not necessarily the respect of the readers, but the trust of the readers, then I think you've got to think very carefully before you go into print with anything that is anonymously sourced. Because if it looks far-fetched and looks too good to be true, it probably is. And I think that, you know, what lessons can one take to history writing from that? Well, the lesson I've taken to history writing from that is to try and be as thoughtful and as deliberative about old sources that I'm using as much as I am about new ones. As I said earlier, the difference between old sources is that there are usually, and if you go to the Times newspaper of the 20s or 30s, and I agree very much with Adrian that there's that was an era where actually a lot of truth happened to be written in newspapers, and newspapers were quite reliable. You can double check, for example, the ins and outs of what happened in the collapse of the Labour government in 1931 and its transition to a coalition by checking endless letters and diaries of those who were involved at the time, and also the cabinet papers and the departmental papers at the time. So it's a lesson you can take to history, but it's much easier in dealing with these moral and ethical questions when you're writing history, because you're often in a position to write it without being anonymous and saying, actually, this person said this at the time and it was a pack of lies. You can't easily do that in the first 24 hours.
Simon, can I put to you that sometimes that, you know, journalists are not very good at convincing people that it's worth reading old newspapers, because in a sense, you know, the classic history story in a newspaper is always about secret documents that have just been released, and slightly sort of fetishizing secret archives. And we were talking before the session started about the MI5 releases, the latest batch of MI5 releases, and there was a spate of newspaper stories about the story that Flora Solomon had kind of outed the spy Kim Philby in 1962. Shock horror. Well, actually, we've known since Spycatcher was published in the 1980s about Flora Solomon. And actually, there's a huge amount of good information out in the public domain in the press. And so perhaps journalists don't always do themselves a sort of a favor in the way that they report historical stories.
Well, I think that's true. And that goes back to this question of how well the average journalist who reports a historical story is trained to know historical method and to work out whether, you know, how to present a historical story. Now, you can't expect every journalist to have a PhD in history. What you can expect them to exercise is good judgment, and to consult people who do perhaps have PhDs in history for what we're worth, and ask them what they think of these matters. I mean, generally, you know, there have been some real horrors in journalistic history. One thinks of the Hitler diaries, the Zinoviev letter, of course, where the press has, you know, or some parts of the press have behaved abominably and ignorantly and with prejudice. But those cases are relatively rare when you think of the millions of stories published in newspapers over the last 100 or 200 years. And that should be an example to journalists dealing with questions now. You know, it comes back to this question of what is or isn't historic. And as was said earlier, historic is something that happened, well, before, you know, it hasn't happened in my lifetime. Well, if you're 95, then it probably is quite historic. If you're 25, then it probably isn't. And
Anna, you've been waiting to come in.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about this question of truth, and I wonder if, I mean, as a historian, I feel always that I would always want to qualify my, I mean, would I say that I'm writing the truth? I would say I'm writing as much as the sources allow me to know, and I know that there's gaps in the sources or whatever. And I think a good historian, you know, makes that clear. My sense perhaps is that journalists feel, are more confident about and less nuanced about, they're saying that this story is true and they're more, I don't know, there's a sense that they perhaps don't appreciate the fact that what they're gathering is still mediated facts, even if they see them as truth. And I wonder if historians are slightly more careful about that use of truth. That's not to cast aspersions on people's motives and methods, but I'm not sure that, can we ever say that a piece of journalism is true? I mean, it's true as far as the facts that have been gathered lead to suggest a certain interpretation or narrative, but that's also true of history. But I'm not sure that you would necessarily find historians talking about definitive truth in the way that perhaps journalists do. But maybe I'm misrepresenting journalists, and they are more nuanced about the accounts that they write.
Anna, there was Becky Rutherford in the chat wanted to take up something you said about the need for historians to be more assertive in stepping into the contemporary moment. What could you say a bit more about what you meant by that, and how particularly sort of young historians should think about how they do that? I think you're still muted, Anna.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there's been such urgent changes, whether it's our relationship with Europe, the wider world, our questions of national identity, the kind of culture wars and so on. And so much of it, the discussion is often very contemporary and very superficial, and to some extent quite ill-informed. And I'm just very conscious that also just in terms of employment, I mean, journalists are trained and have, a sense of their career. There's lots of people that come through trained in history, and I think perhaps they don't see that there is an opportunity and indeed a need for them to inform. And I mean, obviously the work of history and policy speaks to this, historians infiltrating into the civil service and so on, as well as within at different journalistic platforms. I do think, I mean, partly I always encourage my PhD students to look for opportunities to write and write journalistically. I mean, initially in places like History Today and BBC History Magazine, but then when appropriate in the mainstream media. I mean, I would say that there has been a sense where journalists, ring me up and want me to give them, for a 3-hour phone call, a load of basically research information, which they're going to be ripping off as their own, and they may or may not cite me. And I do think there's a little bit of a kind of code of conduct that I think journalists sometimes have the habit of almost thinking that to be using you and talking to you is that they're doing you a favor to make you feel relevant, when in fact you're giving them important expertise. So, I mean, I think that I have had bad experiences as well as good working with journalists.
Yeah. Alan, you wanted to come in?
Yes, just 3 points arising out of what's happened, of what people have been talking about. One is about social media, and I think, I mean, obviously there's a lot of rubbish and trash out there and unreliable stuff, but I do think there are techniques of verification that people are, the best people on social media are experimenting with at the moment. So some of the people I follow, I'm quite interested in the law, because I spent too much of my life being sued and with lawyers. And there are some fantastic lawyers on Twitter. And so they don't start from the premise that I'm a lawyer, I'm a QC, I'm in this chambers or whatever, you must believe me. They begin by saying, really, here's my assertion, and here's my evidence. So increasingly in a Twitter thread, you'll have an assertion, and it'll be accompanied by a screen grab or by a link. So they're showing their evidence as they go. And the other thing that social media does, that if you want to build up a respected position on social media, you obviously have to allow people to respond. It's a given that people will respond. it's increasingly a given that you will then respond. You'll be in the thread. You won't just dump something and then run away. So you'll be responsive. And it's also a given that if you get anything wrong, you clarify it instantly, or you correct it, because if you leave something uncorrected on social media, people will pile in and say, how can you be trusted? This is simply wrong. And I think those are all good techniques for establishing trust in the 21st century. And they're also the opposite of what a lot of journalists do. So a lot of journalists actually do say, well, I work for this paper, or I am this person, so therefore you must trust me, and I'm not going to give you a link or explain who this person is. You just have to take it on trust. They don't want to respond or engage with readers. And quite often, with some newspapers, regrettably, it's incredibly hard to get them to correct or clarify or set something right. So I think, and I think maybe it also goes a little to what Anna was just saying about, I think it is in the back of a journalist's mind now that if they write something that is outrageously untrue, they will be mauled on social media. And I think that does actually, before you write a sentence, you think, actually, if this is going to be pulled apart on social media, I think it does act as a bit of a corrective, and it does probably introduce a bit of nuance into what you write. Just a couple of other points on things that we've been talking about tonight. One is about the archives, and I could completely agree with Adrian that newspapers have been terribly careless about their archives. In the early 2000s, the New York Times even gave away, they sold their entire archive, thinking that it would be of no interest. And they had to go and buy it back, realizing that there was a value in the New York Times. At some point, The Guardian gave away its entire back archive. Luckily, they gave it to Manchester University, and it's there. And I remember going there some years ago, and the archivist pulling out a letter from Emmeline Pankhurst to C.P. Scott, incredibly angry with him about some leaders that he'd been writing about the suffragettes and their tactics. And I thought about this week with the kind of editorials that we're reading everywhere about the tactics of the Extinction Rebellion crowd. And in fact, I've just commissioned a historian to write a piece about the editorials from 100 years ago and the editorials today, and the possible legislative consequences that are being threatened to people and the right to protest. The final thing on what historians can learn from journalists, and I talked about the other side of the coin, but I mean, there is an awful lot. I'm sorry to say this in front of a group of distinguished academics, but we all know perhaps that some academic writing is truly terrible, and occasionally academics will sidle up to me in Oxford and say, "Could you look at this or this? I would like to get this wider circulation." And I think it is true that there is a directness and a tightness in journalistic writing that I think this is what Anna was saying earlier, that actually that you can learn from journalism, and a thinking, a care for the audience and what you're expecting them to put up with, which is sometimes lacking in some academic writing.
I mean, I don't think the academics here will need telling that there is some very poor academic writing out there. But I mean, just slightly to jump to the defense of historians, I mean, I do think that amongst academics, there's still a premium on good, clear writing in history. And if you walk into Waterstones and you look at the kind of rows and rows of history books, you can see that there is still quite a kind of crossover because of that. I want to sort of come back to the social media as well. I mean, Suzanne McGregor has asked a question about this. What's the effect of the current 24-hour news cycle presence of the internet, etc., on the ability to spend time weighing evidence, think and reflect before making public comment. Social media is sometimes presented as a bit of the villain of the piece, both in terms of sort of encouraging people to rush to judgment and sometimes to false judgments, but also, I suppose, undermining the kind of the more thorough, expensive, investigative journalism, which is arguably journalism at its best. Adrian, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think if we think historically, what the internet has done is end scarcity. I mean, in sort of previous media generations, I mean, there is a scarcity, whether it is of newspapers, which have dominated certainly in Britain by a handful of national titles, and then you have a sort of duopoly on television, and you gradually inch towards a few more channels. What we see really first with sort of satellite and cable, and then properly with a global internet from the 1990s is the sort of complete end of scarcity. And I think what the internet does, I mean, it does two things. I mean, and Alan was sort of suggesting this to some extent. I mean, the good element of that is the end of scarcity allows a much greater diversity of voices, and I think that has opened up the media landscape to an awful lot of different voices, often for the good. And I think there is anybody who has looked back at old newspapers will know the sorts of claims, whether it to do with sort of gender or race or class, that could have been made in certain periods, which now would meet with a very fierce response from people who have a voice and a platform and can write back. And as Alan was saying, I mean, journalists know if you write something that there is there will be a quick response. And so it has opened up, I mean, I think historically that is the real shift. It's opened up a platform for different voices. I mean, I think, as Alan has also talked about and written about, I mean, there is a real danger, though, of all of the restraints and checks on writing and journalism and whether things are truthful or not have gone out the window. So, I mean, that's the danger, is that information that is not true can circulate much more quickly than it could have ever done in previous decades, and that's a real danger which we're still grappling with. And because of the end of scarcity, I mean, there was that sort of filtering and judgment. It might have been a sort of a filtering done by a certain set of people, but there was certain elements of usually some form of quality control. That's completely gone now, especially in a global market. So I mean, I think just the other thing I wanted to respond on the social media point to Jeffrey Patterson on the sort of different side of social media, to what extent are historians discouraged from public engagement out of fear of cancellation. And as a head of department in Sheffield, I know that this is something that colleagues really do worry about. And this is the other side of things where, and there's nothing new to culture wars, there's nothing new to historians and other academics being enrolled in vigorous sort of political and public debates. But I do think what is new is that individuals can be targeted much more quickly, much more brutally. And I think universities have not really got the mechanisms to support academics. So I know lots of people who are writing, say, on Irish history, on imperial history, on topics of gender and sexuality, who have felt very alone or lacking guidance from their institutions because they have said things which may have been misinterpreted, may not be at all controversial in a sort of academic conversation, but very quickly can sort of lead them to be the target of an attack on social media. So I think that it is a real worry from sort of the academic side. And I think as a profession, as a discipline, we need to think through some of those questions a lot more carefully, and there does need to be more of a duty of care, I think, from universities often as well.
Thank you. Anna, you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Aitchen was saying there. I mean, I just also wanted to pick up on the question of sort of quality control, because I think, aren't we in danger of saying that anybody who, you know, broadcasts or whatever you want to describe it on social media is a journalist? I mean, I think we have to think about journalism as a profession, as a craft. And I think we have to think of being a historian as a profession and a craft. Now, obviously, the sort of social media age and the proliferation of outlets means that, in a sense, you know, is anybody who sets up a website and writes history a historian? And is anybody who, you know, blogs and circulates stuff on social media a journalist? I mean, should we not be thinking about these two really important professions as professions, and therefore distinguish between just somebody who's tweeting on social media? I mean, my sense of social media, as I sort of said, I do think it's a really important historical source. When we look back on it and we get a sense of what people are, I mean, it is kind of reportage that people are, you know, talking and tweeting about. But I'm not sure that just because someone, you know, writes a thread giving their perspective on something, that makes them, you know, that makes it an act of journalism, if that's not the wrong phrase. Alan's probably got something more informed than I have to say. Jump in, Alan.
Alan, yes.
It's such an interesting and impossible question, this. I mean, partly in this, I think Adrian touched on this earlier, that this word journalism or journalist is such a baggy word that describes so many things. So that, you know, the papers that Simon and I worked on have not much in common with Fox News, I would say, in terms of how we would regard journalism. The Sun is journalism, the New York Times is journalism. They've got almost nothing in common. The BBC is journalism, the Daily Mail is journalism, but they're completely different ideas of what journalism is. And there's journalism of ideas and journalism of reporters. So we just use that one word to describe something, and then say, well, this is a craft that we should ring fence, as opposed to all that stuff on social media. And I think the problem is that we really can't agree the rules of the craft ourselves. And we're not willing enough to acknowledge that on social media, I referenced lawyers earlier. I mean, they really know what they're talking about. They are experts, and they are using journalistic methods to communicate with people. And you have people, these new creatures like Bellingcat, Elliot Higgins, who started life as an accountant and was literally the blogger in the garage, who's now become one of the most respected sources of conflict. At what point did he move from being the aimless blogger to being a world famous authority to whom journalists now go and pay respect because he's so it? I mean, I think Anna's put your finger on a really difficult question that, you know, regulators and the legal system is also grappling with, which is how you define what a journalist is or what journalism is.
There's a related question here from David Vesey. Is a sense that self-censorship, far from being a product of historical constraints, has now become a function of partisanship? Simon, would you like to?
I'm not sure what he means by that question.
Well, I suppose, I mean, I suppose not raising certain things, not saying certain things because it doesn't help your cause. I mean, that
may well be true. Yes, that may well be true. I mean, I hope I've never done it, but I'm sure that some people do. And I mean, I'm afraid I don't wake up in the morning worried about what people are saying about me on social media, but maybe I'm very unusual. But I know a lot of people do. And I think a lot of younger journalists too. I mean, at my age, at my stage in life, I frankly couldn't care less. You know, they either accept my opinions or they don't. And they don't like them, they don't have to read them. But I can see that if you're 30 years younger than I am and making your way in journalism, then you are going to get very nervous about causing a Twitter storm in a way that an older journalist won't. And I'm quite willing to accept, I have no proof, that some people may be worried about saying certain things in case it damages them. I wonder whether I could just quickly go back to what Anna said about the professions of history and the profession of journalism. When I was a very young journalist, over 30 years ago, I remember being metaphorically smacked very hard by an older and wiser journalist. When I referred to the profession, he said, it's not a profession, it's a trade. He said, you may have a university degree, but you've not passed a single professional qualification to be a journalist, which was entirely true. And you consider yourself to be a tradesman. I don't want to get into inverse snobbery, but I've never considered journalism to be a profession. Whereas, you know, I do have 3 degrees from a reasonably good university that say I might well be a historian. And so, yes, anybody, I think, can pass themselves off as a journalist. You don't have to be in receipt of a salary check from a great newspaper organization. You can go into, set up a website and blog and put out things, and you claim, well, I'm writing for public consumption, therefore I'm some sort of journalist. I agree there are degrees of journalism. It's, I suppose, going back to pre-1962 times in cricket, players and gentlemen. But somebody who holds a position in a university and is paid to teach history, you know, they have professional qualifications that enable them to do that. And again, you can go and look at this bank of books in Waterstones, some of which of history books, some of which are written by people who do hold academic positions, others of which are written by so-called amateurs. I was once one of those amateurs. I later became a professor. I was very lucky. But I don't know that I'd have considered myself a professional historian when I started out. I was just somebody who wrote, who wanted to write a book or two about history. That has changed. And I think there are degrees in both terms, actually, that we need to bear in mind.
I mean, can I just come back on that quickly? I mean, the origin,
please.
I mean, am I right in thinking that, you know, the origin of the word journalism was the writing, editing, publishing of a daily journal. And therefore in that sense, I mean, to kind of argue against myself, I suppose, you know, those people who kind of, you know, use Twitter as their kind of daily commentary on something, I mean, maybe that means, you know, that marks them out as a journalist in the sort of modern development of that definition. So, I mean, in that sense, anyone can be a journalist. But as Alan said, I mean, I suppose it's interesting because when Simon or Alan are or have received applications for jobs from people who, you know, want to be journalists, I mean, I guess it might be interesting. Is it based on what people have done in terms of investigative projects? Is it in terms of what training they've had? I mean, can you just be somebody who's had some really good scoops and just self-taught, really, or would you tend to go with people who have had formal training or a university background?
Alan, were you?
Well, no, I think the truth is it's not brain surgery. I mean, when social media started, journalists used to say, oh, citizen journalist, I wouldn't like to go to a citizen brain surgeon, as though the two things were comparable in terms of the training. And, you know, there are people who have walked off the street or straight out from university that I know, I'm sure Simon would say the same, who are fantastic journalists and have had very little training. Equally, I would encourage young people to have some kind of training, because I think it's useful to think about and practice the kind of decisions and craft of writing or broadcasting. But I completely agree with what Simon said, that it's not a profession, it is a craft. And one of the reasons it's not a profession is that the professions tend to be regulated and you could be struck off. And none of us wants to live in a world in which journalists could be struck off.
Yeah.
I mean, Alan, you mentioned Bellingcat. It's a really interesting phenomenon, which is, again, about the advantages and disadvantages of the information age. I mean, one no longer needs very expensive teams of researchers. The amount of information that is potentially available to someone with a laptop sitting in, you know, the Highlands of Scotland is quite incredible. And that's perhaps a problem for journalists and historians, indeed, as much as an asset. That just the sheer weight of information that is now available to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that you should talk to people as well, and then there are some things that can only be obtained by face-to-face contact. But Bellingcat has demonstrated that if you have people who are amazingly digitally able, they can find out astonishing stuff. I mean, it was really sad to me when Seymour Hersh, one of the my journalistic idols, who wrote about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and much more, was completely trashed by Bellingcat about some of his work in Syria, and Bellingcat, to my satisfaction, completely proved that Seymour Hersh was just wrong, and it felt like the passing of a generation from people using one kind of technique to people who were sitting at their computers and mining the extraordinary resources available at the click of a mouse.
Adrian, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are echoes of some of this for historians too, and I think one thing that it's interesting that history too, I mean, unlike something like law or accountancy where there are qualifications in that way, I mean, yes, there might be degrees and PhDs, but I think history can be practiced by lots and lots of different people, and I think historians in the academy have probably, or they should really have a certain amount of humility about some of the good material that is being produced by community historians, by local historians, by amateur historians, and often on sources that are underused, or adding perspectives that academic historians have not taken up. And I think it's on the information overload thing as well. I mean, I remember hearing a talk many years ago by Eric Hobsbawm, who remembered that in the 1950s, he reckoned he could basically read all the historical journals that were being published and could keep track of everything going on in the field. And now there's this absolutely huge proliferation of academic publications, some entirely unreadable, as Alan has sort of suggested. But not all good history comes in journals or from academic historians. And so I mean, I think part of what we need to reflect on, what are the traits and what are the signs of good journalism, of good history. They don't necessarily come from somebody who's paid by a newspaper or who is employed by a university department, and some of that will allow us to reflect on what it is that good journalism and good history contributes to public discussion, I think.
I mean, Adrian, you're talking about the need really to sort of mentor and protect academics in terms of their contacts with social media, but perhaps with mainstream media as well. I mean, maybe you could comment on this, and Anna as well, as someone who is in a sort of a communications department. Is there role for more formal training for academic historians in this area?
Yeah, I think there is, absolutely, and I think there is, particularly amongst a younger generation of historians, I think there is a real appetite to do engaged history and to show how historical perspectives can add quality and perspective to public debate. But often there's a real lack of awareness of how to find the right channels to do that, and historians can be quite naive and can be burnt by, as Anna said, the journalist phones up. Young historians might get quite excited by speaking to a journalist, thinking that they're going to get plenty of credit, and then sort of find either that they're completely uncredited, or that their words have been sort of, you know, very much misinterpreted and you know, feel quite sort of, you know, sort of damaged sometimes by you know, that and having being a bit more savvy and being a bit more aware of what journalists need, how to respond to journalists and how to talk to them in the right sort of way, and what control they have and what they don't have, I think would be really useful.
Anna, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, at City, we do offer media training to PhD students and academics. I mean, and I think it's something that really, you know, increasingly, you know, history departments who offer PhDs should do, not just because, I mean, it's an opportunity for income generation, it's about profile raising, but it's also about, as Adrian said, protecting individuals from the kind of pile on by certain things they might get involved with on Twitter. I mean, I did an event once at an academic history conference, a sort of panel on PhD to pitch or PhD to publication, and there was so much interest from young academics about how they could kind of conceive their research into something that had a kind of practical application, whether it be to inform journalism or some other sort of broadcast output. So I think there's a real need for, I think, you know, young people want to increasingly feel that their studies, their work informs the moment. I think also people who are often, a lot of PhDs now are self-financing. There's less government funding. So I think people feel like they need to have as many kind of strings to their bow. And I mean, for me, you know, somebody graduating with a history PhD who, you know, can write 100,000 words in, you know, in a manner of writing that can vary from really brilliant, crisp, clear sentences to very long, unwieldy ones. I mean, I think that's something that we should really move against. I think we need to be looking for, you know, historical writing that is clear and that communicates ideas in a way that a non-specialist can understand. And I think, you know, where good journalism and history and good history intersects is being able to write clearly, but in a nuanced, considered way. And I mean, that's certainly, you know, the best journalism synthesizes complicated ideas, arguments with sort of verifiable evidence and example in a way that people understand. And I think, you know, that's a common cause for both journalists and historians, or should be.
And thank you. And I mean, just to wind up the other side of the coin, just as a little bit of a blatant plug for History and Policy, of which I'm director. It's a network of about 500 historians nationally, and of people who've written for us at one point or another over the last 20 years. And almost by definition, the people in that network want to make their research publicly available. They want to, you know, they want to assist journalists and policymakers understanding the past and understanding the present in terms of the past. How could something like History and Policy assist journalists most effectively? How can historians reach out to journalists and make their research known most effectively? Simon.
Well, I think I've yet to meet a newspaper editor who isn't thrilled to see well-researched information about some important historical matter, whether it's 10 years ago or even 100 years ago. I know when Jill Bennett's book on the Zinoviev letter came out, I think in 2018, and a very good book it was too, a number of papers picked it up because even 94 years after the event, it's such a lodestar, if you like, in our cultural history that it's still better to people. So if you've done some research on something that is going to interest the public, and that's a question of, first of all, your judgment and the judgment of the editor to whom you send it, then I think that that's a very good idea.
Thank you. And Alan.
Well, it's incredibly, the world has flattened. When I was starting out in journalism and I tried to get the attention of the editor of a national newspaper, it was almost impossible. Now you follow them on Twitter and I mean, people regularly pitch to me on
Yeah.
Twitter and just slide into my
Yeah.
DMs, and so, you know, find your journalistic heroes, follow them, and get into conversations with them.
It's a very good piece of advice. We've reached 7 o'clock. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, Simon and Alan and Anna and Adrian, and thanks to all our audience for some excellent questions.